Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 71 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Dallas Stars, in which the Sharks have lost 6-3. But before we jump into this game, it is important to take a look at how the standings are shaping up, because not only were the Sharks in action here tonight with this regulation loss to Dallas, but Chicago were also in action against the Calgary Flames, and they won their game in regulation. Along with the two previous wins this past week of the Chicago Blackhawks over the San Jose Sharks, they now find themselves 7 points ahead of San Jose in the standings, meaning the Sharks have a 7-point gap between them and the next possible closest team that could take the last place spot from them in the entire league. Now, this doesn't necessarily secure that last place spot. You never know what could possibly happen over these last 11 games. The Sharks could go on some sort of crazy hot streak, no matter how unlikely that may sound. But it definitely does seem as though the Sharks have given themselves the best possible chances to get those top draft lottery odds by the end of this season, which is a pretty big success, all things considered, for how this otherwise bleak season has gone for San Jose. But to move into how this game actually went down, this was the third and final matchup with the Dallas Stars, and while the Stars are one of the better teams in the entire league, the Sharks have actually had some pretty competitive games against Dallas this year, requiring some post-regulation time to decide them. And while the Sharks had lost those two previous matchups, they were at least very interesting games to watch. This one didn't start out that way. In the first period, it was pretty much all Dallas, as they would score the first and second goals of this one to make it 2-0 Stars at the end of the first period. And then immediately at the beginning of the second period, within just 14 seconds, Jason Robertson would make it 3-0 Dallas. However, we know from just 3 days ago in the Sharks matchup with the Chicago Blackhawks, in which they similarly had two first period goals followed by a very early second period goal, that any lead in hockey is not necessarily secure. Obviously, it's quite clear that the Dallas Stars are a significantly better team than the San Jose Sharks, so you wouldn't expect them to blow a lead, but the Sharks would actually end up making this game relatively interesting, at least in the second period, as they would cut the lead to 2 with a goal from Barabanov, and then shortly after cut the lead to 1 with a power play goal from William Eklund. Jamie Benn would respond to restore the 2-goal lead, but then Klim Kostin would score to put it back to within 1. Unfortunately for San Jose, while they came close, they never quite closed the gap completely, and it would be the Dallas Stars once more from Wyatt Johnston who would restore their 2-goal lead and never look back from there. This is because as we then headed into the third period, the Dallas Stars, like so many other teams, pretty much woke up and said, wait a minute, we're against the worst team in the league. Let's kind of just close this game out. And that has been the case over this current losing streak for the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks have lost 8 games in a row, and over that time period, in the third period, they have been outscored 20-1. The Sharks have managed just a single third period goal in the third period, while giving up 20 of them against. So it is quite clear, even against the bad teams like Chicago or Columbus, that they go up in that third period, that final frame against San Jose, and they say, okay, let's stop messing around here. Let's just finish this off. And they managed to do exactly that. Dallas here tonight, no different. They only managed the 1 goal on the power play from Robertson again, but that's enough to close it out 6-3. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Kostin. Like with the recent times, I would say, over these past few games, David Quinn was not hesitating to use the line blender here tonight, especially as the game went on when Barabanov ended up leaving with an injury. But at least to start off, it was a top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Kostin. Kostin's probably the most interesting player to take a look at on this top line. He had a very up and down game. In the second period, I thought he really was quite solid, but in both the first and the third periods, there was a bit to be desired. The thing that I've noticed about Kostin is that he has a lot of upside when it comes to his offensive plays. He's got solid vision, something I've already mentioned in the past. He's got a very nice shot that we saw on full display on his goal here that he scored against the Stars. But on the other side of the coin, and those are the reasons why teams are consistently giving him opportunities and giving him contracts, but on the other side of the coin, we also saw some issues defensively for Kostin. While he usually finds himself in the correct position in the offensive zone, he frequently finds himself in the incorrect position in the defensive zone, heavily overcommitting to pucks instead of playing it in the smart sense. So the hockey IQ that is quite high from the offensive perspective is actually relatively low, at least from what we have seen in recent times from the defensive perspective, which is also one of the reasons for perhaps why teams have also been quite ready to move on from Kostin in their lineup. At this point, you're kind of just hoping for him to be a net positive, and with the amount of points that he has put up since being acquired from the San Jose Sharks, that is very much the case, especially for a team that has struggled to score the entirety of this season. Kostin still remains a net positive for San Jose, but you could definitely see the cracks in his game and why he's not just some diamond in the rough forward that the Sharks have suddenly uncovered and unlocked the true potential of. When it comes to the other two forwards on this top line, honestly, nothing particularly impressive. The Dallas Stars are an extremely deep team, so there's never really a particular matchup that you can abuse on that. You're either facing off against the top line or the fourth line, 1 through 4, all very, very solid players, and Zetterlund Granlund could never really find a ton of space to make too many things happen. When it comes to the second line, it at the very least started out with Barabanov, Kunin, and Zadina, but pretty quickly, I would say, Zadina actually got dropped to the fourth line and swapped with William Eklund. And that would be the trio of players that would manage to score the first goal of the game for the San Jose Sharks. That one coming from Barabanov off of a pretty nice pass from Eklund. So Eklund has found himself on this fourth line over these past few games as a sort of chance to maybe get his game back, so to speak. He had been, since pretty much the All-Star and bye-week break, been playing as the second-line center for San Jose, and he's just not really been able to excel at all in that particular position. But getting him onto the fourth line allows him to go back to basics, allows him to go back to that wing position where he's able to really more focus on actually doing well compared to having to have that 200-foot style of game that a centerman is expected to have at the NHL level. And so I think that has really very much worked in his favor and has allowed him to work himself up to this second line, and even at the end of the game up to the first line, as he ended up swapping up places with Kostin as well. So Eklund definitely one of the better Sharks forwards on the night. When it comes to Barabanov, not insanely apparent. He had his goal, which was quite nice, but didn't exactly do much outside of that, and then he would end up getting injured, so there's not really much to say. When it comes to Luke Kunin, I mean, I can continue to harp on the fact that Kunin is not a second-line center, and I would very much like it if, for instance, at the end of the game, we saw some shifts with Kunin, Eklund, and Bordeleau. I would obviously much rather have a different centerman in that position, but again, there's not really many better options. Technically, you could drop Granlund to play with Bordeleau and Eklund, but besides that, you're putting up Nico Sturm, who's really not that much better. Ryan Carpenter is obviously not a very good option there. So then your choice is to perhaps call somebody up from the Barracuda, but is there even a good choice from there? So at this point, you're kind of stuck with Luke Kunin in position. He didn't really do much of anything in this game, and that's kind of what you're expecting to happen over these last 11. When it comes to the third line, we have Sturm, Bailey, and Bordeleau. Bordeleau, as per usual, standing out in a pretty decent way. In fact, what's quite interesting here is that even though relative to the rest of the competition on the San Jose Sharks, I actually thought he was one of the better forwards that they had, but relative to some of the games he has already played since being called up, this was maybe one of his weaker ones. At even strength, I didn't notice him a ton. He had that really good chance, I think it was maybe early in the second period or perhaps late in the first period, where he almost managed to get a goal off of a pretty nice pass. But besides that, he had a really good pass on the Eklund power play goal, but even strength, not a ton. Doing still a pretty good game, though, like I said, relative to the rest of the team. When it comes to Justin Bailey on the other side of things, I was pretty hard on Bailey over these past few, besides the last game against Chicago, because I don't think he'd really been fitting in on this third line. But I do have to give credit where credit is due. Last game against Chicago, he was quite good. Here tonight, he was actually still pretty decent and hanging around well enough on this third line. When it comes to the fourth line, we have McDonald, Carpenter. Eklund did take a few shifts, but like I mentioned, Zadina ended up dropping down. This fourth line really didn't do much of anything, I would say, in this game, so not much to comment on there. When it comes defensively, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows. And like I said, when it comes to the Dallas Stars, they are an extremely deep team. So while some teams you can match up Ferraro and Burrows against the other team's top players, for instance, just in the previous matchup against Chicago, if you put Ferraro and Burrows up against Connor Bedard, you're not really having that much competition on the other lines that the Chicago Blackhawks have. Not the case with Dallas. And so you might be matching up with the Joe Pavelski line, but then who's matching up with the Jamie Benn and the Wyatt Johnston line? Or who's matching up with the Radek Faksa line? Those types of things. So I will say that these two players actually did decently well. Not great, nothing outstanding. Pretty much par for the course for what you would expect from the San Jose Sharks defensemen here, where they're not getting completely exposed, but I guess they did a relatively serviceable job. The major issue for the Sharks is coming once again from the extreme wild card that is this second defensive pairing. In particular, Henry Thrun stands out in a pretty negative light once again, with many issues continuing to crop up in his game. In one of the early shifts where he ended up taking a penalty, we saw him give the puck away multiple times before being forced to take a penalty in that situation to kind of get the whistle, stop play, and then head to the penalty box. We saw on one of the goals that the Dallas Stars scored where Henry Thrun is unable to box out his man from the front of the net. He's just not able to clear that. You need to have that inside position. It's not exactly what he was doing. And then on another situation, we see Henry Thrun lose the race against his man, that one being Wyatt Johnston, I think on his second goal of the night, the one that made it 5-3, which kind of put the brakes on the San Jose Sharks comeback. That's one that Thrun is unable to keep up in that situation. So multiple mistakes once again standing out in a very obvious light for Henry Thrun. I don't know if he's maybe playing through some sort of injury or he just seems to have lost what he originally had a couple of months ago, but it really hasn't been smooth sailing at all over this last month. Outside of a few select games where he had actually performed pretty well, he used to be a very consistent back in the before All-Star break. There was a good month time where he was quite consistent, but then since going down with that injury and then coming back after the All-Star break, he has not been able to find that same level of play. So again, I don't know if there's some sort of lingering issue here that's preventing him from having that same style. But at this point, it's not very good. And it's honestly somewhat surprising, but also I guess not that surprising that he manages to maintain a spot. I think if the Sharks had better options, Thrun could be the one getting healthy scratched at some point. But because the Sharks, they traded a Hutchuk, and besides maybe calling up like someone like Shakir Mukhamadullin, you're not really having any other choices. Thrun manages to maintain a lineup spot, but it's kind of borderline at this point. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, we have Vlasic and Addison. The good news, these guys were not nearly as bad as they have been at times this season. The bad news is that doesn't necessarily mean that they were particularly good. It still means that they were kind of but I guess that's better than the usual when it comes to these two, at least over the last couple of months in Vlasic's case. And then finally, we have the goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. 6 goals against here tonight, a couple of them that he absolutely should have been able to have. The first Robertson one is a pretty weak goal. The second Robertson one is a nicer shot, but still one he could have made the save on. The Johnston one, the Marchment one, also not the most impossible saves to have made, so definitely a relatively rough night for Blackwood. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will be taking on the Minnesota Wild. So they were just up against Dallas, who was pretty securely in a playoff spot. There was really no worries for them to drop out. But when it comes to their next matchup, Minnesota, as well as the matchup after that, St. Louis, both of them are fighting for their playoff lives, right on the outside looking in, right within striking distance of the last wildcard slot, which is being held currently by the Vegas Golden Knights. So the Sharks, they're definitely going to be playing against a team that is ready to go. Class dismissed.